Hi guys, this is Pastor Kathy, not Pastor Jared. I know we changed things up on you today. Sharing with you a deep dive on Scripture. And today specifically, I'll be looking at my sermon text from this morning, which was based on Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. Now, to begin with, in looking at the Scripture, you're going to notice that I do things differently than Jared. I'm just going to give you that outline of what I do, the questions I ask, what I look for in Scripture when interpreting it. So if we don't get to everything today, at least you'll get at least a framework for how to interpret Scripture, or at least my method for doing so. To begin with, I do a little survey of the segment. So I'll make an outline, but instead of making an outline in outline form, I just put it on a chart. So I summarize the Scripture, the whole Scripture, encounter on the Emmaus Road. And I break it into 2 parts. And then I break it into 5 parts. And these 5 parts, you're going to see later. I'm calling them subunits. And we have our intro, setting up the Emmaus Road experience. We have Cleopas speaking. It's his little story of what had transpired over the past 3 days. Then we have Jesus interpreting the prophets to the 2 disciples on the Emmaus Road. Then fourthly, we have Jesus breaking the bread. He took the bread, blessed it, broke it, gave it to the disciples, and that was then when their eyes were opened. And the disciples returned to Jerusalem. It's the end cap to the story. It's the ending of what happened. It's also important to note the genre of what you're reading. You're not going to read poetry the same as you would like a logical argument. So our segment of Scripture of the day is officially called prose narrative. That's just a fancy way of saying it's a story. It's just Luke reporting something that went down in history. Now, when you're telling a story, Luke could have easily said, there are these 2 dudes on the road. They saw Jesus, didn't know it was Jesus. Jesus interpreted Scripture for them. Then he broke bread with them. The 2 disciples realized who they were talking to. Jesus disappeared. The disciples went back to Jerusalem. And that could have been it. But that's not how Luke tells a story. Stories are told with intention. They're told with structure. And so we're looking at the relationships in that structure. How is the story moved forward? How does Luke present this? And so I'm looking for different structural relationships next. And I see there's a lot of contrast. So contrast is the association of opposites. And so in Cleopas' little speech, there's a lot of conflicting elements there. The people recognize Jesus as a prophet. He's put to death. He's not really dead. According to some women, he's been resurrected. He's alive. This hasn't really been verified yet, but some of the other disciples went to the tomb and saw that his body wasn't there. So, what's going on? There's contrast. And then after I identify the relationship, I ask questions. My first set of questions is based on what and how. What's the meaning of this? What do each different section means? How are they related? Next set of question is why? Why are these things contrasted? Why are they present? Then finally, what are the implications of this? The so what? So there's a contrast. What's so important about that? Also notice that there is a cruciality or pivot. That's just a fancy way of saying the Scripture took a left turn. So you have these disciples, they are moving along. They were sad. They were blinded. They didn't see Jesus beside them. And then all of a sudden, in verse 31, their eyes open and the story goes this way. There is a pivot. They're moving this way and then they go this way. There is a point in the story in which everything changes. And that point for us is verse 31, when their eyes were open. You can say it's probably verse 30 as well, which is when Jesus takes the bread, blesses it, breaks it, gives it to them, because that's what causes them to recognize him and have their eyes open. Either way, there's a point of change, major change in the story. I described that, and I asked my questions again: what and how, why, and what are the implications? Also identified a third important relationship, instrumentation. And what that means is that Luke gives the means to an end and the end point. And I saw this in verse 26, where Jesus says, wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer so that he could come into his glory? And I saw that verse as a focus point that Luke is explaining through Christ that it was necessary for Jesus to suffer. Those are the means, the way to the end goal. And the end goal is that he would come into glory. Now, what that glory means, I don't really know. We don't know yet. We're just observing. But we see this movement and the importance of expressing these means of suffering, these means of Christ existing, really, so that the end goal can be achieved. Again, I ask my questions. I look at the important verses. We've already looked at verse 30 and 31. That's the pivot point. You could argue that each scripture verse has an important role somehow, but that's just the one I identified. Maybe you identify differently. And then other major impressions. Jared likes to write down the setting and our characters, time frame. You'll see, I write everything down because you never know what might strike your fancy. It might stand out to you. So I started off with the atmospheric. So what's the mood of the story? And here there's a pivot. So it goes from confusing to Jesus kind of scolding them a little bit to having the disciples' eyes open. Then I note the biographical information. And I write down any person, individual, or group that's named. We see disciples, 2 disciples. Eventually one's given the name Cleopas. We don't know the other guy's name. He's apparently not that important. Jesus is mentioned 4 times by name, so the more something's repeated in the scripture, the more important it is usually. We see that Jesus is called prophet, but we also see that the 2 disciples, call him the one who would redeem Israel. But they don't really define what that means for them. Moving on down, we look at our chronological information, the time. So Luke especially is very keen on grounding the stories in reality and giving them a firm basis in history. I mean, chronological time also means how is the story being propelled forward? What are the descriptors that are used to give the passage of time within the scripture? So it's the same day. Literally begins with on the same day in verse 13. Are we told what that same day is? Not in our little segment. We also get things like 3 days ago. We pick up on this morning. We see words like then, which is used a lot, but we use then a lot in our stories to move the story forward, to show the passage of time, to show causation, the movement of one thing to the next within a story. And the day is almost over. So it started off the same day, and now it's the end of the day. Geographical. So the different places listed. We have Emmaus, Jerusalem, Israel, the tomb. Pretty basic. Historical events. So what history takes place? You have the crucifixion, the resurrection, the writings of prophets. What ideas are expressed? Again, it's the resurrection and the necessity of the passion. And also, revelation is central to this passage of scripture. Being blind to Jesus, having your eyes open. Then I wrote down different terms and phrases that I thought might be important, that I found were interesting. Then I began taking notes and then making my observations on the scripture. And so whatever's in bold is scripture, whatever is not bolded, it's just my notes. It's usually stream of consciousness. It's asking a lot of questions. It's asking clarifying questions like, where is Emmaus? What's going on there? What does it mean that their faces were downcast? And just making different observations. Like Cleopas speaks here in this sentence and Jesus answers him, but then they said to him, both disciples are the ones who tell this story. And there's plural pronouns used throughout the story, but is that those pronouns referring to just those two or all the disciples? What's that going on there? It's also interesting that the women had a vision of angels. Come to that. And we continue taking notes on our scripture. If you've listened to the sermon, you've actually heard most of these notes. Then we ask ourselves the question, what are the major components of this segment, the meaning of the components, and the function? So again, using our 5 subunits identified earlier, the introduction, Cleopas is explaining the story, Jesus interpreting the prophets, Jesus breaking the bread, the disciples returning to Jerusalem. I summarized each of those again, describing the meaning of those, but also saying how they are related and why they are important in this story. So it's like the explanation of the problem. Cleopas telling his story. The explanation gives us insight into what they're feeling: confused, grieving, conflicted. Jesus interpreting the prophets. The people, Cleopas and the disciple, had been saying Jesus was the one who we thought would redeem Israel. But did they know who the one was? They missed out on all the scriptures that said the one would have to suffer and die and be resurrected. They clearly missed out that. So did they see who the one would be? Did they really understand what that means? And so we continue. What is the interpretive significance that the story is set where it's set? We'll look at the first part of Luke chapter 24, and that's the story of the empty tomb. And when we read this story, we see that the angels directly appeared to the women. When Cleopas retells the story, the women have a vision. And I think that's an interesting thing, that the women's eyes are open that Jesus is alive. They have a vision of that. But Cleopas doesn't actually understand. He doesn't have vision yet. He doesn't have sight. And so he says others have a vision, or have the vision, so to speak. Then immediately after our verse 35, the end of our scripture, Jesus appears to the rest of the disciples, and then he eventually ascends into heaven. And again, he reemphasizes everything written about me is in law, the prophets, Psalms, had to be fulfilled. Then he opened their minds to understand the scripture. And yes, opened is a play on opening their eyes. So Jesus opened the scriptures to the two who were on the Emmaus Road. He opened their eyes in the breaking of bread. And now he was opening the minds of all the disciples. There's this progression, this growth of what it means to have your eyes opened by Christ. So it's going from scripture all the way to minds being opened. Continuing on, I'll look at the major problems addressed here, how these problems related, how are each addressed. It's really just one major problem that I identified, and that's blindness. They are blind to Jesus. They're blind to the greater narrative of who Jesus is. There's this issue of not being able to see. And the answer to that is sight. And that Jesus provides sight. And that he opens our eyes, or the eyes of the disciples. And where the claims here, the meaning of each, It's mainly Christological. Christ is the center of this passage. He is the Messiah. He was a prophet. He is a prophet. He is the one who would redeem Israel. He fulfilled Moses and all of the other prophets. And he was the Christ. So it was necessary for him to suffer and then come into his glory. And then I looked at the different ways to apply this segment. Explore the significant ways in which a segment can be applied to yourself and Christian ministry throughout the contemporary world. So that means is, so what? So we have the story of the Emmaus Road. We have the story of these two disciples being blind and now having sight. What does that mean for us? And I originally wrote a section on how are we blind? How are we closed-minded? How are we distracted by the world around us? How are we conflicted on who Christ is? Do we see him? And how can we open our eyes? And I jotted down some initial ideas: being still, looking for Jesus, expecting Jesus and his present, hearing the familiar words of old, seeing his actions in those around us. And my research continued from here. I look at the background of this story. So customs change over 2,000 years. Imagine that. And so I look at the customs and the original culture and how it would apply to the scripture. And I use the IVP Bible Background Commentary by Craig Keener. That is in our church library, by the way. When we can return to the church, you can check that book out and see for yourself the different background items about scripture. Originally, I thought that the disciples invited Jesus into dinner with them because they liked him. According to the culture of the day, it was just hospitality, and that they were obligated to welcome Jesus into their midst. It's not that Jesus was interesting, they enjoyed talking to him. It was just a part of their culture. I also look at word study. I don't speak Greek or Hebrew. Jared can interpret it well. I can't. So I go to blueletterbible.org. It's an open resource for everyone, and I can look at the definitions of words. I can look at their verb tense. Can look at how it's used throughout Scripture. Just real quick. I know we've hit 15 minutes. I am so sorry I'm going over the phrase prevented from recognizing him. The word prevented is in an imperfect form. What that means is that it's an action that started at a particular point in time and it continued. So throughout this entire conversation, they were prevented. And it's passive voice, meaning the action was being inflicted upon them. So they weren't causing their blindness, but something else was causing them to be blind. The word prevented literally means to hold in check, to restrain. And whenever it's used in the New Testament, it's always used as some variation of hold. So I thought that was interesting that their sight was withheld. It was held from them. And finally, what I do is I look at the interpretation of others. I look at what others have to say about the scripture. And there are different commentaries out there that there's some in the church library that you could check out one day. You can also go to textweek.com. And on textweek.com, it has a lot of the ancient commentators. So you can look at what someone in the year 300 AD thought about this scripture. And I think that's pretty cool. And I challenge you to look that up. Find what Augustine had to say about the Emmaus Road, because I thought that was very encouraging. But I'm not going to tell you, so you have to find it yourself. There's you can also look up the early church historians, and then they have different commentaries throughout history. So I get one, I look at what the early church says, I look at what John Wesley says, so that's 1700s, look at Matthew Henry, which I think is the 1800s. I look at the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, which I personally have, and it's in the church library, it's not online. And that's modern day, contemporary interpretation of scripture. And so I gather all of these things, all of this information, and kind of synthesize it and weed out what's important and look at where I was incorrect in my initial interpretation of scripture. look at what supplements what I said, and I do all of this, and then I summarize it all into a sentence. Jesus opened the eyes of the disciples, and from there I just write the sermon and craft it together with all of this information, using what's important and ignoring what isn't important. So I hope you enjoyed this deep dive of scripture. I hope I haven't bored you too much with my ramblings, and I hope that you have a very safe day. Please continue to shelter in place. Before I got online and began recording, I looked and saw how many new cases we had today. It was 300 people have come down with the virus, and just tested positive within the past 24 hours. So please be safe. Please take precautions. We love you, and we are praying for you. Just know that you are cared for. And that will be all. Thank you for joining me. Bye.